from LexisNexis, which is a lot cooler than some of the previous places he's worked. He's been at eBay, Apple, and Pinterest, so nice household names. But he has a background, obviously, in human evaluation, A/B testing, and so he actually leads up the kind of experimentation team, data-driven analytics experimentation team at LexisNexis. And so with that, we'll flip over to him and let him talk to us about better design through experimentation.
Hello, everyone. Hope everybody's having a nice evening, even though it's a little soggy outside. Thanks for coming out and listening to me blabber on. So I really appreciate it, and I want to just kind of start off a little bit by asking folks, how many of you know what A/B testing is? Yes, everybody, excellent. How many of you use A/B testing to make decisions on a regular basis? Yeah, it's a little bit weaker. That's okay. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about A/B testing and about what it is, how we can use it to make better products, and I'll maybe throw in a little bit of story time too. So hopefully that'll be interesting for you guys. As Wes said, I've had kind of a bit of a varied career. I started out as a human factors psychologist and got really interested in search engines when I was in graduate school. And that got me out to Silicon Valley, where I was measuring search engine performance through human evaluation at eBay, as well as doing surveys. There I was a product manager. And then I went to Apple. At Apple I was a statistician on the Maps team, but I also worked with iTunes. And then I went to Pinterest. There I was a data scientist. And now I've come back east. I'm now at LexisNexis, where I'm the director of global product testing, which is basically just a glorified product manager. So kind of come full circle. I've always been in the position where I'm sort of data-driven product guy. And sometimes that means we don't know where to put me. So sometimes I'm data scientist, sometimes I'm analyst, whatever, right? So I imagine that other people have kind of similar experiences. Sometimes organizations don't really know what to do with people who are sort of in that cross-product of data and product. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about experimentation and trying to build a culture of experimentation. So we're going to start off talking about like the what and wherefore and why and how of A/B testing. I'm going to go through that kind of quickly, and then hopefully do a little story time, and then we'll be able to have you guys ask me some questions and all that. If you spot something interesting and you want to ask questions, it's a pretty small group, feel free to just raise your hand and or shout, "Hey James," and I'll be happy to answer questions as we're going through. All right? Cool. So the first thing I often get asked is, what is A/B testing? Well, apparently this table moves. A/B testing is just a controlled method of testing a hypothesis. So it's really just a way that we can validate our ideas, right? So as product people, we probably have ideas, or we work with engineers, they have ideas. We got to prioritize those things, figure out what to do, what's going to make our product or our business better. Testing is also how we challenge our assumptions and defeat the hippo. And there's a lot of different ways that you can make changes. One of the big ones, especially early on in an organization, often is the hippo, right? Steve Jobs is actually famous for being a hippo. The hippo, by the way, is the highest paid person's opinion. So oftentimes that's how decisions get made, is that the senior director or vice president of blah-de-blah is the guy who gets to make the decision. And that probably works okay if the senior director of blah-de-blah happens to be Steve Jobs. I don't know about you guys. I'm not Steve Jobs. Are any of you Steve Jobs? No? Okay, nobody here is Steve Jobs. That's cool. You can listen to the rest of this then. So, there we go. Without having some data, the hippo is going to win, right? So the vice president of something or other is going to say, "No, you can't do that," like this fellow Greg Linden from Amazon. And Greg had this great idea of putting recommended products on the checkout page at Amazon. So stuff that was similar to items in your cart, you go to check out, it's like, "Hey, you might also like this thing." And some SVP of something or other was like, "That is a terrible idea, I forbid it." But guess what? You probably see where this is going. Greg did it anyway. And they were making just such a ridiculous amount more money off of this that they basically had to go implement it first. And that happened because Amazon has a really robust testing infrastructure and program around that, and they have, most importantly, a culture of experimentation. Oops, there we go. There's my big cross-out thing. Yeah, no more hippos. A/B testing is really about making these continual improvements. So it's about making small changes a little bit at a time and climbing that mountain and making your product a little bit better through every iteration. Three of my favorite quotes about experimentation. One you might guess from Jeff Bezos. As I said, they have a real culture of experimentation at Amazon. It's not an experiment if you know it's going to work. Well, there you go. So you shouldn't be afraid of running the experiment. However, every experiment owner or every feature owner ever says my experiment is going to be a huge success. They all do. Doesn't matter who they are. Everybody knows that their change is the best. It's going to help us win. But it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. If it disagrees with the evidence, it's wrong. So that's what experimentation is about in a nutshell. And the reason why we do that is people are bad at guessing outcomes. So here's a little audience participation. Can anybody tell the difference between the left and the right? Maybe these. Yeah. It's all pretty subtle stuff. But if you look over here on the right, the link is a little bit darker blue. The domain name is a bit darker shade of green, and then the blurb text, snippet text, is actually a little bit lighter shade of black. It's a little more of a gray. Anybody care to guess which one of these won in the A/B test? Folks are saying the right. Okay. What are they testing for? You're going to find out. Whoops. There we go. The one on the right is worth about $10 million. Yeah, $10 million in annualized additional revenue for the Bing search engine. Yeah, about $10 million. Well, they're trying to maximize revenue, right? Their search engine. They're in the business of making money. So that's what. And you also notice that this is kind of the top of the SRP, and that's generally kind of where the ads go. So that there specifically was about trying to get more click-throughs on ads, and they did. $10 million worth. Not bad. So the thing about that is that subtle changes can have a big impact. However, those big impacts are pretty infrequent. They're like 1 in 500, according to the guys at Microsoft. So really, you have to test a lot of stuff. But subtle changes, big impact, got to test lots of stuff. You should be trying lots of things all the time, is kind of the moral of that story. So how does A/B testing actually work? Well, first we got to start with an observation. And this observation can kind of come from anywhere, right? A lot of times we're just using our intuition. Maybe we've noticed something in user testing. Maybe we've been using our product ourselves, eating our own dog food, as they call it. Once we make that observation, then we have to form a hypothesis. So I've got a website. My website, for whatever reason, has a bright red background. Nexus. And maybe we also really like red, so we made our submit button on this particular page red, because red is great. We love red. But maybe I think perhaps people can't see that submit button, and what I need to do is make that submit button a little bit more obvious. So perhaps what I could do is I could change that button color to blue. Now I'm starting to form a hypothesis. We're not just making a guess, we're making a guess that we can measure. And as my friend back there who's getting some pizza has noted, what are you trying to measure is a really important part of that. So your hypothesis should be SMART, which is specific, measurable, actionable, repeatable, and time-bound. That's what the T stands for, sure. We're going with it. So what you want to do is, basically, you've got to be able to prove yourself wrong. So what I could say, a hypothesis for this would be, if I change my submit button color to blue, I will increase the click-through rate on this red web page. And it'd be great if we actually put some numbers around that. We'll increase click-throughs by 10%. Great, now I've got a hypothesis. Now I can go measure that, and I can prove myself wrong. The ideal test would be that we actually take our users and we put them into a parallel universe. And then we just measure which one is more successful. Parallel universe with blue button or parallel universe with red button. Sadly, that is impractical. More realistic approach that we want to take is just randomize our users. So we take our users, shuffle them, split them into two groups. Randomly decide half of them are going to get the red, half of them are going to get the blue, then we're going to measure them on some outcome variable. And see, in this case, smiley faces are our outcome variable. We've got more smiley faces in blue. Hooray! In reality, though, what you actually measure is a lot more complicated. So this is an actual dashboard from Pinterest. And what we see are the kind of the x-axis here are days in, so the number of days that users have been in the experiment. And then the red or the blue indicates that that particular metric is up or down significantly. If it's gray, it means it's not statistically significantly different. So what we can see here is that whatever this metric is here, it looks good. There's a lot of blue there. Hooray! But there's lots of other metrics that don't look so great. So, I don't know. So this is kind of a challenge, right? So we have to actually figure out what is the most important metric. What is the metric that we really give a shit about? What's going to drive our business? Funnily enough, at Pinterest, you might imagine it's DAU, daily active users, but this is super hard to measure and move. So repinners. How often are we actually getting people to repin content? Because that is an indication that they're getting value from the service. So it kind of sucks that it's down at the bottom of that page. It's not great. Not great UX, I gotta be honest. I think they've changed that since then, but there we go. This is about half of this dashboard. There's just as many under each one of the tabs in the top two. So there are literally hundreds of metrics that we measured at Pinterest. So the x-axis here are the number of days in the experiment. So it's kind of like a cohort analysis if you want to think about it that way. So yeah, we slice and dice data lots and lots and lots of different ways. So maybe too many different ways. And really what you want to do is you want to figure out what's important and optimize for that. One metric to measure if you're familiar with the lean parlance. Then we're going to interpret those results. And to do that, we use statistics. Everybody's favorite dirty word. So a lot of people don't like statistics. I kind of love statistics because the answer is always probably. There's varying degrees of certainty. Probably? I don't know. But really all we're doing is we're just trying to get the confidence to understand that this difference is real or random. So those of you who are more familiar with statistics might realize that a dashboard like this has literally hundreds of individual tests that may or may not be correlated with one another, so there might be a whole lot of statistical error going on here. So all those little red squares, those might be spurious. They might be significant. I don't know, probably. But really all we're trying to do is look at the difference between a couple of samples and try to figure out if that is a real meaningful difference. And we use statistics to do that, like try to figure out what's the distribution for the actual population and see if we move that. So I was showing the experiment dashboard there from Pinterest, and you noted that the x-axis is over time. Why do we want to do that, right? Why can't I just measure for one day? Because experiment results can and usually do change over time. So it could be that our blue button treatment is actually doing really, really well at first. Hooray! But then it gets worse over time because actually clicking that blue button sends you a bill in the mail. Oh, I don't want this bill. Why did I get this bill? Oh, it's because I clicked that stupid button. So if we just had the control, it stays flat, hopefully. It'd be weird if it didn't. But we can see that the treatment will change over time as our users learn that clicking that blue button actually gives us some bad outcomes. So this is something important to note, that experiment results could change over time because of a learning effect. And then they could also change because engaged users tend to dominate early. So again, this is from Pinterest again. So we have three main groups of users: core, casual, and marginal. Core users are, by definition, weekly active users. So what you see is that within 1 week, kind of by definition, you will have seen all of them. But your casual users, who are monthly active users, it takes you a lot longer to see all of them. But there's a whole lot more of them than there are the core users. And then finally, there's marginal users. There's even more marginal users, people we see kind of once in a while. But it takes a lot longer to get them in there. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you actually have a large enough sample of each of those groups, and that you give them enough time to see the new experience, and then you measure them appropriately. So you have to run an experiment for, in this case, at least 4 weeks to really get a strong signal and know that it's good for all of those different user groups.
So to try to hit those segments, you don't assume like a random sample to take care of that, or you don't do random sample.
Right, so do you do random sampling? Yeah, you should this is from a random sample. However, just because there are more marginal users doesn't necessarily mean that you will have more in that sample, right? Because every time you're sampling over day after day, those core users just dominate, right? They're the people that show up every day. They're the ones who are doing the most rebitting and so on. So they're the folks, like, even if you take a random sample, this is the kind of proportion that you would get for any individual day. And I have to stop here because I just have to say that I absolutely stole this from one of my friends at Pinterest. His name's Andrea Burbank. She's got some great stuff on YouTube. I link to it in the back of this deck, which I'm happy to share with folks. So don't think that I am a super smart person. I'm just completely great artist. Good artists copy, great artists steal. Great data scientists definitely steal. So make sure that you're measuring the right set of users. That's the first thing. You got to trigger and instrument your experiment properly. Otherwise, you risk diluting the experiment. Okay, so we're going to go in the weeds a little bit here. And again, this is another thing that I stole from Andrea, so forgive me. So we wanted to run an experiment on Japanese search. So this is kind of a real example. So it changed the search results for users who actually searched using kanji or katakana characters. Yes, that was it. So not every user in Japan would see a different experience. Not every user in the US would definitely not see a different experience. And so we've got a bunch of users, we've randomized them, and we've put them into two groups, treatment and control. Now if we just measure who's happy, who's got a successful search session, they're about the same. But if we take a look at the users who searched in Japanese and actually used the kanji or katakana characters in their search, we see that the distribution looks a little bit different. So if we then take a look at our happy users, what we see is we've actually doubled the number of happy users who actually saw that experience. So again, a little bit nuanced, but the idea here is that you want to make sure that you're really measuring the people who you're truly affecting with your changed experience. So at LexisNexis, we've got a search page, we've got a document page, we've got a delivery page. So let's say we run an experiment just on delivery, which changes how you deliver a document to yourself or somebody else. If we ran an experiment on that, if you didn't do a delivery action, I want to get you out of my data set. I don't really care what you did, right? Well, I mean, I care, but I'm not going to measure it, right? I want to see who had the different experience and measure the difference for those users. That's really what I care about. Then you have to draw the right conclusions. So this is one of my absolute favorite stories. Dr. James Lind was a doctor in the British Royal Navy, and he noticed that Mediterranean sailors did not get scurvy. He was like, that's interesting. Made this observation. Maybe it's because they eat a lot more fruit. Okay, now we've got a hypothesis. So he gave half of his sailors limes. This is one of the first randomized controlled trials. He said, you on this boat, you get limes. You on that boat, you don't get limes. He didn't tell them that, just the ones that got limes. He was like, here, eat these green fruits. The half that got limes, they didn't get scurvy. Amazing. But then what happened was he was like, well, if limes are good, you know what's going to be better? Concentrated lime juice. So he took a bunch of lime juice, cooked it down, gave that to his sailors. They all got scurvy. You know why? Because when you cook vitamin C, it destroys the vitamin. So what we have to do is we have to actually draw the right conclusion. It wasn't just about lime juice. It was about vitamin C. Of course, he didn't know about vitamins back then. So the British Royal Navy started giving their sailors limes, and to this day, English people are called limeys. There we go. Now you know why. The more you know. All right. This is one of my favorite lessons. If you're not failing, you're not trying. This one's a really hard one to absorb. We're going to talk about it a little bit more later, but really the only test that fails is the one that you don't learn something from, like my buddy Bart Simpson here, who keeps touching Lisa's electrified cupcake. It's like, cupcake out, cupcake out, cupcake out. He didn't learn. So really that's a failed test. Any other test that you learn something from, not a failure. Complexity is the enemy. Now I know you guys are all like product people, and you're like, well, I don't want to climb this hill, slowly marching up the hill. I want to go to the next hill. Look over there. There's a big mountain over there. If we do our business a little bit different, we could 10x our revenue. I know it. Yeah, he comes talking to you. Look at him. He's like, 10x this shit. Yeah, we're gonna blow this out of the water. This is a whole new thing, man. Whole new thing. We're gonna reinvent the entire user experience. It's gonna be great. Problem with that is that you load up a bunch of stuff together, and then maybe you test it, maybe you don't. Maybe you just wait for the revenue to come piling in and the accolades. But lo and behold, maybe you actually end up in the valley below. Right? Mountains and valleys are adjacent. So you could end up at the bottom, you could end up at the top. You wouldn't know why you ended up in either place unless you broke it down. Take it each piece and break it down piece by piece and try it. So I give the folks at LexisNexis a hard time because we used to have a service called LDC, Lexis.com, and then we were like, we're gonna do something cool. We're gonna make a whole new thing. It's gonna be called Lexis Advance. Must be cool because it's called Advance. So they re-architected the entire back end, redesigned the entire front end, rolled it out, and you know what? People loved it. No, they didn't. They hated it. And we don't know why, right? So problem was that you put a bunch of stuff in there, and then you launch it out there into the world, and you don't know if it's going to do good or not. And if it doesn't do good, I don't know why'd that happen. Well, you got to make sure that you've broken it down, instrumented it, formed the hypotheses, tested each piece, and then you climb the mountain. Like, I don't know, it's tough. You do this, you iterate some more. The lean folks have lean, whatever they're called, lean analytics. Lean analytics people have a thing that looks like this. I didn't steal this from them. This is my idea. But basically, you start with research, wherever that comes from. That's your hypothesis. That's your observation. You do some design. You build the thing. You test the thing. You review, and that's going to give you some more ideas for the next thing because you're learning something, right? Because the only test that's a failure is the one you don't learn something from. So you make sure you do this. And you do it again and again and again. And each time you go through this cycle, hopefully you're taking a little step forward and making your product a little bit better, one step at a time. So, any questions so far? Stunned silence. I love it. Oh, there's one. Yes.
So what tools are good for setting up tests?
What tools are good for setting up tests? We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. Because there's a couple of different ways that we could do it. So let's talk a little bit about how experimentation helps you build better products. Not IKEA furniture. By the way, IKEA furniture is a great experiment if you determine that you might want to marry somebody. Build IKEA furniture with that person, and if you're not killing each other with the little hammer and screwdriver by the end, you marry her, or him, or whatever. I don't judge. Experimentation helps you mitigate risk. Right, you wouldn't jump out of an airplane without a parachute, right? You got to be able to back out of the situation. Experimentation can do that for you, right? Now you're not investing so much. You're not saying, I'm betting the farm that this UI redesign with my back-end overhaul is really going to fix everything. It's going to make it all perfect, right? There's no parachute there. Whereas if you said, all right, I'm going to swap out the back end, and if there's a problem with that, I can go back to my old back end. Oh, there's a parachute right there. Or you can say, well, instead of re-architecting the entire front end, you could say, I'm going to change my button colors. I'm going to streamline this a little bit. I'm going to get rid of all those filters. I'm going to change the checked boxes a little bit at a time. You're mitigating your risk by doing things a little bit at once. And you can also, learn something. A properly designed A/B testing system decouples the code from user visibility. You ship the thing, you design it, you build it, you ship it, and then you show it to users. So oftentimes what we do is we design, we build, the ship, and once it's out there, it's shipped. The users see it, everybody gets it. A properly designed system is going to decouple that process. It's like a light switch for your code, so that you're like flipping stuff on and off. Some users are going to get it, some users aren't. And you do that through things like feature toggles. That's a pretty kind of standard way of doing things. And that way, you can always back it off, right? That's the parachute. You turn it back off, and you're good to go. No harm, no foul. Continuous integration, continuous deployment. Everybody heard of continuous integration to continuous deployment? As is like the new hotness. Maybe it's the old hotness. I don't know, it's hotness. Everybody loves it. Everybody wants to ship daily. I'm going to ship every hour. Amazon Web Services can ship every second. Every second. And that's like half of the internet runs on AWS servers now. And they ship every second. So everybody's really excited about that. But I like to make sure that we include a learn in here, right? We got to make sure we learn something. So we release it, we deploy it, and we go measure it, right? That's the experiment bit. And then we learn something from it, and then we do some more design. So this is just another way of thinking about my cycle of iteration that I showed earlier, right? So this one just looks a little fancier. It's got better colors, but it didn't have learn, so I had to put that in there. But the main reason we want to experiment is so that we make better products. And how do we make better products? We make better products because we measure them, because we have instrumented things properly, we formed the hypotheses, we've got the metrics in place, and then we go measure them. And when we measure them, we can see, hey, are we doing better? Hey, blue buttons did better than red buttons. Let's try green buttons next. Hey, maybe we should make other stuff look more obvious. Maybe, we shouldn't have a red page background. There's a ton of different things. Every time we run a test, we measure something, and then that should generate some new hypotheses that are going to help us do more later in the future. But first you got to measure. Without measurement, you got nothing. Like what gets measured gets managed. According to that is if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. Yeah, what's up?
Is there a rule of thumb about how many variants in a test? So we have two variants, or 3, or 10, or 200?
That's a great question. How many variants can you put in a test? As many as you can. As few as you need. So the trick there is you have to have enough people, or you have to have enough actions at least, that you can test on. If you've got 50 users, you're never going to get significance really. Even if you did 25, right? If you got 50,000 users, you could have 25,000, 25,000. Now you're talking real numbers. That should get you somewhere. If you're like Google and you got a bajillion users, then you got half a bajillion over here and half. Yeah, you don't need that much traffic. You can slice your traffic into the 10,000s and be able to get significance. So in fact, that's what Google does. Google runs hundreds and hundreds of experiments a year. In fact, they're probably running 50 on us right now. If you've got your phone open, if you use Google Maps to get here, you're probably in an experiment. Yeah. So
if we don't have that scale, how new product is 10 users, then I can't really.
Well, you're not going to be able to A/B test with 10 users. But there's other things you can do, and so you could use, beta tests. You could use lab usability studies. You bootstrap it. You can drag people in off the street and say, "Hey, what do you think of this thing?" So there's definitely ways that there's no excuse for not testing, right? The Silicon Valley Partner Group guys tell this great story about before launching this product, these guys had this idea they're going to launch a drone, and these drones are going to fly over farmers' fields in Kansas and take pictures, and they're going to sell people the pictures. And they were like, all right, our MVP is we're going to build the drone, and they're some advisor guy was like, no, don't do that. Just get some stuff off Google Maps, color it in with a highlighter, and ask people, hey, would you pay for this data? Free. So you can test things, right? If you've got a small like pre-production thing, there's different strategies that you use than you would use for a big like web scale or already existing product. So there's different strategies at different stages of the life cycle. This is for a little bit more mature sorts of things, I guess. Yes?
Is A/B testing applicable or does it make sense to use technology-based products where you have to
That is a good question. Does it make sense for not web products or not technology products? I mean, yes. It's harder to do though, right? It's a lot harder if you're like boxing up software and mailing it to people. Oh, actually, so the guys at Five Guys, I listen to a lot of business podcasts. The guy from Five Guys was on How I Built This with Guy Raz, which you should totally listen to. It's a great business podcast. And he was talking about they tested different kinds of mayonnaise. So he had a couple of stores, and he had different mayonnaise in each one. Now, a lot of it was like just his palate, and he tried different things, but he also tried different stuff with his users. So absolutely, you can A/B test a hamburger. 100%, especially if you got a couple of locations, easy peasy. Now, if you got some people who really like to eat, you could even do like intermingled testing. Like just give them 2 hamburgers in a row and see which they like better. Anyway, I'm distracting myself now, which is all too easy to do, sadly to say. So, measure things. Yes, you want to measure things. What gets measured gets managed. So, now it's story time. How experimentation is done elsewhere. Story in 3 or 4 parts from my time in Silicon Valley. The first thing is metrics matter. So what gets measured gets managed. Having the right metrics is super important. Unfortunately, this is the only screenshot that I could find, but this was early 2010, March 2010. I joined in about that time. I joined in May of 2010. And then September of 2010. What changed? A lot of stuff changed. Why did it change? Because they experimented. What drove those changes? They actually changed the metrics shortly before I got there, around this March timeframe, to switch from number of items sold to gross merchandise bought. Now, what does that do? It does a couple of things, but the number one thing it did for people in the search engine, such as yours truly, business, was it I don't know, I'm actually going to take a step back. Anybody here use eBay 2010 or previously? Yeah, I love eBay. Still love it. If you did a search, like what comes to mind about eBay in 2010? Do you guys remember, like, or pre-2010? Selling floppy disks? Okay, sure, yeah. Gotta do something with those things. Somebody 3D printed a save icon. PayPal integration, it was a little bit before that, but yeah, it was early days for that, I guess. Bidding, yeah. Yeah, because it was all about auctions. Oh, those people sniping, that was me. I was all about the sniping. Interestingly, there's some good papers on sniping and auction behavior, and the sniping is actually the most rational way to proceed with an auction. And if everybody was rational, basically it just becomes a silent auction where you just enter in one bid. So, anyway, never mind. So, I, again, distract myself. When you search for something like an iPod in 2010, or iPhones existed? Yeah, they existed in 2010. If you search for iPhone in 2010, what you actually got was a bunch of cheap cases for iPhones, or iPods if you search for iPod. Lots of cheap knockoff junk. Because if you're maximizing for the number of items sold, it's a whole hell of a lot easier to sell 50 $5 cases than it is one $500 iPhone. But if you switch to GMB, gross merchandise bought, then the weight of selling one iPhone now outweighs about selling a bunch of cheap cases. So as a result, just that one single change changed how we tuned the search engine, changed how we did the interface, and because of how we measured it, we changed all of these little bits and pieces a little bit over time. Some of these things were done several at once. I know it's tough for you guys to see because this picture is super low resolution, But what you see is like there's a bunch of yellow here, the filters are less prominent on the left, there's some stuff pushed down. There's also some other things going on, like these top 2 results are actually sponsored. So basically somebody paid to have their stuff ranked at the top, got rid of that stuff, really started to make it a much more buyer-focused experience. And the reason why had a lot to do with personnel. It brought in a lot of new people. There's a new CEO, it was all about the turnaround, all that stuff. But just changing what you measure changes how you approach building your product. Switching to GMB meant stop selling a lot of cheap crap and switch to selling a few more expensive items. Generally speaking, those tend to be the more relevant ones. If I search for iPod, I wanted an iPod, I don't want 50 silicone cases. So metrics matter. Where did iTunes go wrong? God, I hope nobody from iTunes sees this. Sorry, Pine. So where did iTunes go wrong? It used to be like, what was the quote? It went from being the world's best and easiest to use jukebox software to the thing that you use to manage all your devices and hopefully never have to look at ever again. Like, look at this, man. Like, this is actually mine. This is my music collection. I manage basically none of it in iTunes, right? These days it's all Spotify and Tidal and all that good stuff. But here we go. If I want to sort by artist, I can sort by artist. I can filter artist, album, sort the things, load them on my iPod. Bob's your uncle. Here I've got my library and my albums. How is this ordered? I don't know. Why are there such big pictures? I can't sort them. How can I sort them? I don't know.
It looks like MySpace.
It looks like MySpace. The old one or the new one?
The new one.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. It does. I don't work there anymore. What do I care? So, where did it go wrong? It went wrong because they don't really measure things. They're not A/B testing their way to a better product. They're not trying. Apple is a really, really, really hippo-driven business. I remember sitting in, I literally sat in meetings, and there was a senior VP of engineering, something, and we're talking about the switch to Apple Music. And he's like, I think that when you click this button, this is what should happen. The user should come back here. And I'm like, just sitting there thinking to myself, how are you the best person to make this decision? Seriously. We're all users, right? But how is this one guy the best guy to make this decision? Don't we have usability people that we could go talk to? Don't we have researchers? Can we A/B test this? Nope, not how it works there. I once got told by a guy who was in charge of analytics. He said, a little tongue-in-cheek, but he did actually say this. He said, why do we need A/B test things? We're just supposed to know what people want. No. On that day, I decided to leave. It's not entirely true. I decided to leave a lot earlier than that. Meanwhile, at Apple Maps, which was the other company that I worked for, the other part of the company that I worked for, it's hard to explain. This is one of the reasons I left, but whatever. Apple Maps went from going a thing that would tell you to walk in a circle or take a long walk off of a short pier to something that you can actually use to navigate the streets of Paris, ride on the metro, do all of these cool things. And it works pretty well. It ain't great. It can do some things that the Google Maps can't do now, which is cool. Like the transit thing's a lot better. But why did that happen? Early on at Apple, I think that they were kind of thrown into the business of guidance and maps. They didn't want to do it. They were happy to have Google Maps, and then Google was like, you know what, we're just going to take our ball and go to Android and play with it. And so Apple had to scramble, and they were like, well, we'll just buy some map data from company unnamed, and we'll put a pretty skin on it, because we're Apple. We make things pretty. That's what we do. And then it'll be great. No problem. So they had 5 people working on it, none of whom were data people. And it sucked. People were taking long walks off of short piers or driving onto Alaskan airfields or, driving through the outback getting stranded because they didn't have gas. So those were bad. And that's the kind of stuff that Apple doesn't need, right? They don't need that kind of PR. So they fixed it. They got a lot of money and they threw a lot of it at Apple Maps. So Apple Maps went from having 2 testers and a couple of statisticians to having a test organization that's 1,000 people deep now. And they A/B test everything, they human evaluate everything, and they generally canary release things as well to make sure that things don't fall over. they have this process called the 5 gates. They presumably still have that. They had it when I was there. The idea is that you really want to make sure that things are right before you ship them. But you can do all of this through A/B testing, and you can improve your product dramatically through A/B testing. And they did. Pinterest. All right. More than just food and shoes. Did you know that? Yes, lots of great stuff on Pinterest. So Pinterest is probably one of the most data-driven companies, certainly the most data-driven that I worked at, probably one of the most data-driven in Silicon Valley, and that's saying something, maybe behind Google. Like, they literally experiment on everything. Every part of the site is experimented on. Growth, SEO, email, search, images, image size, how the pin is formatted, everything is tested. But it wasn't always that way. They actually did a change where they changed the entire backend, the web framework. They changed to this new web framework, and they changed some UI elements at the same time. They shipped all of that. It was kind of this project that everybody was just like, I want to be done. Get done with this project. And then they shipped it, and then the metrics tanked. And they're like, why did the metrics tank? We don't know. We didn't instrument this thing. We didn't A/B test this. So they had to go back, re-instrument each piece of this framework change, and figure out what actually drove the negative behavior. Turns out there's actually a few fairly simple UI elements, and had they just A/B tested each of those pieces individually, they would have figured it out from the jump and not wasted a lot of time and effort. But, it was early days for the company back then, before I got there. By the time I got there, they had a really robust infrastructure for A/B testing, and everything was really run through that. So a lot of my job was actually looking at those experiments and making sure that they were good, making sure that we weren't looking at spurious correlation, that kind of thing, and really applying a bit of statistical rigor on there. But everything on here was A/B tested at some point or another. So the guided search thing, that's a thing. They A/B tested it. Yeah, performed well. We got more searches, more engagement, more review pins. Success. So, it's really.
Isn't that related to the traffic? I mean, if within a period you see more searches, what does that have to do with your search bar? It's more related to traffic.
Well, that's why you A/B test, right? Half of them didn't see that, and half of them did. So I'm not comparing, you to you from a week ago. I'm comparing you to him. And really, I'm doing that, thousands and thousands of times over, so I can have some statistical confidence that it's not just a spurious effect, that it's actually a real thing. Because I've tested it on lots and lots of different people who have lots of different reasons for being at the site. So, yeah, it's a great point. We want to make sure that we're, doing things the right way. That one was a big one. Lots of other things too, recommended pins, lots of those sorts of things. Everything got A/B tested.
So I kind of want to back up for a second about what you're suggesting in order to get this data. You're talking about testing on a live product. So you're talking about testing on the real Pinterest that is live and out there.
Yes.
And you're saying that you tweak one thing here, but not on every server that gets put out. It's only on some of them, so maybe half your people are going to see the red button versus the blue button.
Right. Yeah.
And then you're going to change it back at some point. So you need to have a very fluid interface that seems to change a lot of people. Does that have a negative effect? Does that happen where you're like,
So
okay, log in, it looks different?
Yeah, so you're talking about this kind of change fatigue idea, that as we're experimenting, changing things on the site, people are going to get sick of the idea of it being different. Google's actually handled this pretty well. I think your expectation is that things are going to look pretty similar, but there's going to be some differences, right? They got a different doodle every day. They got, but the underlying algorithm, you don't really see it so much. You don't necessarily expect to see the exact same search results every day. It's a little bit different than LexisNexis. We maybe have that expectation, so it's a little bit more challenging. Yes, change fatigue could very well be a problem. It does help that a lot of these businesses that I've mentioned are basically giving their stuff away for free. Right? At Google, you're not the customer. Sorry, you're the product. right? And it's actually true for Pinterest as well. I'm sorry if I shattered anyone's illusions. But really, right, those are advertising-based businesses, and their job is to try to get eyeballs and keep them there as long as possible. They're going to do what it takes to do that, and I think there's an expectation around change at those kind of businesses. The other thing I would say is that it's a lot more disruptive to change a whole bunch of stuff at once, like a lobster getting dunked in head first versus the frog in the pot. You turn it up a little bit at a time, and the frog doesn't notice soon enough the water's boiling. Same effect, but one is much more disruptive than the other. So making lots of small changes is a lot less disruptive to users than like, hey, guess what? We just shipped 8.3 and we changed the entire interface. Oh, yay. Now I gotta learn where my cheese goes again. As opposed to like, oh, we just made the button color blue. Okay, I can learn that. Oh, we changed the text of the button. Okay, I can learn that. Oh, we moved where the button is a little bit. Okay, I can learn that. Whereas if you did all of those things at once, it's more disruptive to the user's flow and what they're trying to do. But even any big product, right? Yeah, I mean, even the biggest project you can break down to smaller pieces. I think that we tend to think, like product people, we tend to think about shipping like big changes. I want to change all the stuff. Change all the stuff. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I think that A/B testing and the release train, I think, granularity go together pretty well, and we'll talk about that in like 10 seconds here. So, how do we bring experimentation home? So, somebody asked me about that earlier. First, you want to start with picking the low-hanging fruit. You've heard this expression before, but there's probably a lot of things that you're looking at in your product and thinking, gosh, I wish that was better. That is the thing that irritates me the most. Or you've gotten feedback from some user, someone sends you an angry email, whatever. Like, start small. Pick that low-hanging fruit. You can use third-party software to help you get kind of bootstrapped off the ground. So Optimos is one, Optimizely, Adobe Test and Target, Google Optimize. Locally here, there's a company called Brooks Bell, who's a consultancy. They will help you get this thing started. Deliver wins, show value. One way that you can do this is by using services that maybe aren't your main website. So perhaps you've got a marketing site that you can test on. Perhaps you've got an email system that drives traffic. Probably a lot of you do for your product. So try different versions of the email and see what gets traction. That's a lot easier to do in many cases than trying to do something on your main site. As frustrating as that might be, deliver some wins and show some value first. You'll get support. And why is getting events? Okay, we'll talk about why you need support in just a second. But getting advanced. So we're in the process of kind of going to a more roll your own approach, where we're actually building an A/B testing platform internally. You could go open source. There are services that you can just download from GitHub. PlanOut from Facebook is the big one that I can think of. There are others. Then there's commercial integrations. So Optimizely has a product that will actually integrate with your own code and will enable you to use their service to trigger feature toggles within the code. Integrate into the dev process. So this is kind of what I was talking about with like the release train and all that other stuff. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Hire some data scientists. There are a few of us around. You maybe want to get some analytics. You want to make sure that you're measuring as much stuff as you can. So you want to make sure that the system is there to capture that data so that you can actually make use of it later. And then, this is probably the biggest one. You want to embrace uncertainty. Embracing uncertainty is probably the most difficult thing that you will have to do. It means getting rid of roadmaps. Like, I don't know when I'm going to ship a product now, right? Because I may be testing all the things. I might change what that roadmap looks like. I might change that mock-up from soup to nuts. It may be a completely different thing by the time it actually hits the servers. Instead, what you should be thinking of is, I'm going to learn about X process or X feature at Y time. So that's where you got to get the exec buy-in, because execs are like, I want to know when I'm shipping when. Engineers want to know, hey, when are we going to get this feature out, right? They want to ship things. Engineers like to build stuff. We like to build stuff too, but engineers are like, I want to see the thing that I did go to the site. That's challenging. We got to get marketing. Marketing wants to be able to communicate, hey, we made X change. Come buy our product. And then customers want to know, hey, when's my cheese getting moved? Where did you move it to? Can you provide me some instructions on said cheese? All those are things that you can't really do during the process of experimentation. So you really have to embrace that uncertainty. This is a typical kind of waterfall-y sort of release cycle. Plan, design, develop, launch, maintain. Hooray! Make money. If we're in the world of agile, right? You kind of have a loop here. There's a bit of a feedback loop. You build something, you check it out, see if it's any good. Okay, it's all right. We can do better. Let's go back to design. We tweak some more things, or maybe we're doing things in a little bit smaller increments. But really, when you got A/B testing, it looks more like this. Because what's happening is you're not in this like plan, design, develop phase. You're like planning and developing and designing are all sort of mishmashed together because you're learning about what you're going to build next as you're building it. And you're like, oh, well, red buttons are good. Blue buttons are better. Maybe we should try green buttons. So you're doing this in a much more iterative loop, and you're maybe trying 2 or 3 or 10 things at once. So maybe one user gets green buttons and one user gets blue buttons. You don't know which one's going to end up winning. I don't know. You're trying to build them both at once and ship whichever one works the best. Finally, celebrate success. No. Celebrate failure. Failure is the best. It's like I said earlier, the only test that fails is when you don't learn something from. Right? This is a really, really hard thing for people to do. It is so difficult. I don't want to celebrate failure. I hate it when a test doesn't ship. Makes me feel bad. Those engineers worked for 6 months on that thing. But you know what? If we learned something from it, it's not a failure. We learned, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't have done things that way, or the user workflow wasn't what we thought it was, because you know what? We're not the user experts. Our users are the user experts, and they're going to tell us. They're going to tell us what it is that they want. This is how they do it. They tell us what they want by telling us their hypothesis was shit, and then we were wrong. Damn. Hate when that happens. Let's learn something. Let's figure out what we're going to do next. And then we go back to the drawing board, we do some more stuff, we test some more things, we iterate, and hey, maybe we do get to celebrate some success. Because when it does come, we should definitely high five. We should definitely, crack open a frosty cold one and eat some pizza with the team. Because it's great when it does happen. Why would we want to put ourselves through all of this? It sounds like so much work. It sounds so difficult. I gotta convince my execs that I'm not gonna ship something in April and that's okay. We're just gonna learn about something in April. I don't wanna hear that. Because experimentation drives outcomes. So this is a chart of the growth of experimentation in Bing. I'm sorry, it's very difficult to see, but this was the best I could find. Starting in 2008, all the way through the end of 2014. The chart at the top left is search advertising revenue from Q3 2012 to Q1 2015. So I lined that up for you. That's about where that happened. The growth of experimentation coincides nicely with the growth of revenue at Bing. And guess what? Bing is now a profitable entity. They make money off of Bing. Ain't that something? Even though it's like a third also ran in the search world, I guess it's second place, but still, second place is first loser when it comes to search, man. Google is like the elephant in the room times 20. But they've been able to make themselves profitable, carve out a niche in the business, because they've experimented, they've tested. They show different images, different search algorithms, different ads, the thing that I showed earlier where they're just tweaking the UI just a little teeny bit. An extra 10 million here, 10 million there, pretty soon you're talking about real money. So that's why we do this. Experimentation drives outcomes. So maybe your outcome isn't revenue, maybe you don't care so much about revenue. In that case, can I borrow some money? But if you don't care about revenue, maybe you've got user growth, right? Maybe you're in that bootstrappy phase where you're just like, I want all the users. Give me the users so when Google acquires me, I can make more money. These things tend to be tied together. But the point is, yes, it's a pain in the ass. Yes, it's more work. Yes, it means that you have to convince executives that you may not ship something when you think you're going to ship something, that you're going to learn about a thing, and they're going to be like, what are you telling me? But it's worth it because at the end of the day, Your users are going to tell you what is better, and better means that they're going to help you make more money because they're going to spend more time on your site, or they're going to click more ads, or they're going to like use your search engine more, or they're going to repin more stuff, and they're going to tell their friends, and so on and so on and so on. And those things are really important. So think about what you want to measure. Think about what you want to drive at your business. Go measure it, and then start tuning it. Start tweaking the user experience, making a better product a little bit at a time, and eventually like this. Like this is actually what the shape of that hill that I showed earlier looks like. You get a nice ski slope, and hopefully the revenue comes. So, the moral of the story is always be testing. Coffee is for closers.